Welcome to this webinar with Magda Mostafa, arranged by Skolhusgruppen. And I give the screen to Magda Mostafa, and I hope you present yourself. You are Autism, you are a PhD and architect, and you are Autism design consultant and associate professor of design at the American University in Cairo. But I hope you present yourself a bit more. So take the screen.
Thank you, Suzanne, so very much. I'm very grateful for the invitation and very grateful for the introduction, which is very kind. I was very happy to hear from Suzanne to invite me to this webinar today. Her name is very familiar to me. Suzanne and I both have history working with the International Union of Architects. She's been instrumental to the Architecture and Children program there for many, many years and has been doing some fantastic work and contributed a lot to our recent Congress. I've been involved with the International Union of Architects through their Education Commission and Validation Council, and more recently I've joined their Architecture for All program. So I was very happy to hear from you, Suzanne, and knew your name from our many conversations at the UIA and was happy to meet you in person. So as Suzanne kindly introduced, my name is Magda. I am a professor of architectural design at the American University in Cairo. I'm also the founder and principal of an architectural firm called Studio TM, which specializes in neuro-inclusive design and autism design specifically for this population. I've been working in this field. I'll talk to you a little bit about the history of the time I've had in this field, but I've been in this field for almost 2 decades now, a little over 2 decades now. And one of the things that we're very proud of during that time is that we were able to produce something called the Autism Aspects Design Index, which is what many consider one of the world's first research-based frameworks to think about the relationship between autism, architecture, and space. So what I'll be talking about today specifically is this notion of the autism-centered classroom. And I'm defining that a little bit broadly. So I'll be talking about spaces that are in perhaps classical classroom environments in schools, but also classrooms through the lens of higher education and learning and continuing education. And maybe even the idea of how education and classrooms can be part of health and well-being, or perhaps even thinking about learning through cities and other different ideas, because I don't think that the work that we do as designers to support the autistic experience can end at the door of our schools. We actually have a responsibility to extend the design world beyond our school environments to make sure that the support we can provide for the autistic students continues throughout their time in their cities and their spaces and their communities, but also throughout their lifetimes as they move into higher education or the workplace environment and beyond. So I'll be walking through a few concrete examples of schools we have designed, but I will start first with a little bit of background and history that I think is important because it situates the work that I have been privileged to be in for these many years, just historically around the awareness and diagnostic iterations that autism has gone through in the past 20 plus years. So the question I think I'm asked the most when asked about my work is what brought you into this field? What brought you to this interest? And it began with this building. And around 2001, I was a young mother. I just had my first child. She was a few months old when a group of parents reached out to myself and my husband, who we had just started a small architectural firm, and they asked us to help them design a small school for their children because their children who were newly diagnosed on the autism spectrum could not find a placement in a school environment anywhere in the Middle East. So these parents came together and decided to create their own school. They rented a small house in a small suburban neighborhood in Cairo and asked us to come in and redesign the building in order to house the early intervention. The children were all between the ages of 2 and 5, so they were very, very young. So it was more like a preschool than a proper school at the time. And I didn't have any awareness or knowledge of autism when this request came to our office. So being a good student, I said I would look at the references that we had on designing for disabilities. And I assumed very naively that I would find a chapter or a section on autism amongst the chapters and sections that you find in design references for designing for wheelchairs and mobility challenges, or designing for blindness and low vision, or for the deaf community. And we found absolutely nothing. And I still have to this day a communication that I received from the president and director of the International Building Codes, the International Codes Council, and the International Building Codes. And remember, this was 2001. The International Building Code had only just been published in 2000 in its first version. I reached out to them thinking that perhaps I was overlooking something and something existed globally. And he responded to me and said that they do not have it, the International Building Code or the International Codes Council, nor do they know of anywhere in the world that had guidance on how to design for autism in 2001. So a parallel story to this story is that at that time I was working on my doctoral dissertation's proposal on a completely different topic, something around history, theory, and criticism, very far away from designing for autism. And I had almost completed my proposal and decided to share it with my father-in-law, who was a very established practitioner of architecture who worked for some of the biggest architectural firms in the world. And he read my proposal on history and theory and said it's very interesting and as a piece of reading, but it isn't really something that's valuable to me as a practicing architect. And he encouraged me quite critically to abandon this idea of doing something around history and theory. Not that I don't or he doesn't think it's valuable, but as a practicing architect, he really encouraged me to find a problem that needed immediate attention in the immediate world that I was working in. So I told him about this school, and he said, that's your problem. That's the problem that you should be dedicating your doctoral research to. And he encouraged me to abandon the other proposal that I'd worked so hard on and pursue this one. And that's what I did. I shifted, I pivoted. My advisor gave me about 6 to 8 weeks to come up with a new proposal. And we successfully put that proposal forward. And the topic of searching for these design guidelines for how to design for autism became the subject of my doctoral dissertation. And the school, the Advanced Society, and the Learning Resource Center were incredibly supportive of setting up experimental classrooms with me and with us so that we could engage with the students and the children in the school and start thinking in a way that would help us unlock this relationship between autism and architecture. So I'll begin with those first moments of insight. And you have to remember that I was entering this work with no idea of the relationship, if even one existed, between autism, the autistic experience, the autistic model of perception, and the built world. And I started working with the parents and the students and the teachers to try and unlock that relationship. So one of the first points of insight that I came across was a moment with one of the mothers who shared with me her struggle to find an activity for her son. She had an older son. He was about 10 or 11 at the time. He had been in a school in the United States prior. And in that school, his teachers were searching for an activity that he could be successful in and suggested that he take a photography after school activity. So he was given a list of objects that he was supposed to go out with his little camera and take pictures of. He was supposed to take a picture of a puppy and a boy and a house and a tree and some clouds. And that was his assignment. And he went out and came back a week later, and the teacher called the mother and told her that it looked like this wasn't going to be a successful experiment, and he didn't understand the assignment, and he didn't achieve what was requested of him. So the mother, as most mothers do, advocated for her son and asked to see the photographs. And these are recreations of the photographs as she described them to us. she quickly became apparent to her that what the teacher saw as a failure, that he hadn't taken pictures of the things he was supposed to take pictures of. There was the boy in the frame wasn't the boy, it was the reflection of the boy. The puppy in the picture wasn't the puppy, it was the shadow of the puppy. The house in the picture wasn't a picture of the house, but it was an image of the reflection of the house in a puddle of water. And what the teacher saw as a failure, the mother saw as an insight, as a flash of understanding of how her son was navigating the world. So for those of you who are familiar with autism and some of the sensory challenges that the autistic experience may present, you know that the sensory world may be a challenge for an autistic individual on the spectrum, because there's so much information, so much sensory input from the world around us that it can become overwhelming. And what these pictures showed us and gave us a glimpse into how this young boy was navigating the world, in order for him to relieve himself of the overwhelming detail of his visual environment, he wasn't looking at the objects themselves, but he was looking at their silhouettes and at their shadows. And that experience, that moment, became a turning point in our work, in that it became very clear that it was the sensory world that was the intersection between the autistic experience and the built environment. And that's where the model of our research evolved. It took the position and the hypothesis that almost every man-made sensory stimulation that we are required as users of space to understand, respond to, be affected by, are sensory stimulations that have been decided for us by architects and designers and planners of those spaces. So the noises that we hear, the textures that we touch, the colors that we perceive, the spaces that bounce echoes around and create acoustical environments for us, all that man-made stuff has been decided for us by designers. So if we as designers and architects of space have that much power to create these environments, then we can use that power, if we understand that relationship, in a way that is conducive of that experience, as opposed to a barrier for it. So that's where our work was born. I decided to think of the perceptual model of autism as a process of understanding the world, and try to think upstream of that experience. Up to that point in the autistic work that I was seeing, it was all about thinking, what can we do after the perception has happened? So a child is overwhelmed by sound. What can we do to teach them to handle that sound? What we were proposing was, then why should we allow that problem to occur in the first place? Can we not adjust the environment so that overstimulation at least is mitigated or controlled or curated, so that that behavior that comes out of that sensory stimulation is one that is more supportive, more comfortable, more loving, more caring for that experience? So that began the first point of our work, which is understanding autism as a subject and autism as an object. So I embedded myself with the children of this school for about a year and a half. The first 6 months of it was just being with them in the classrooms, observing them in the spaces. And then we embarked on a year of coding their behavior in space and mapping their behavior in space in a very specific, broken down kind of way, so that we were taking their tasks and breaking them down into vignettes of 20 minutes of observation at a time, recording their movement and the experiences that they were having throughout the classroom. All of this was organized in what we called the sensory design matrix, which took the architectural attributes of proportion, scale, symmetry, color, lighting, acoustics, proximity, sequence, all of these ideas of architectural qualities, and tried to map them against our sensory inputs. And the numbers on this chart are potential intersections between each of these concepts and each of these senses as a potential architectural intervention that could be tested. And the ones that are shaded in gray are the ones that we ended up testing in the school. And the results of that, you can read the results of that research paper or that research project that ultimately became my dissertation and then was summarized in this article in 2008 that we called an architecture for autism. And it was the first beginnings of what later would become the Autism Aspects Design Index, which today is 15 criteria. It began the first inner circle aspects 1.0 was 7 criteria that came out of that first research. And the second ring with an additional 8 parameters came around in around 2020 when we expanded this work to different contexts. But the summary of this is that work that first began in 2001 went through a series of iterations, experiments, and projects. Some of them are schools, some of them are different contexts, but ultimately became a framework of architectural attributes that we need to be cognizant and mindful of when we design for the architectural experience for autism. And right now we are developing this tool to be more dynamic, to not only help guide the design of new builds, but also to measure and score the design of existing builds. So what you see on the screen right now is an example of the Aspects Autism rating scale and how it can be used through a series of checklists and interviews and assessments of designs to measure the autism friendliness of buildings and the aspects compliance of those buildings. And currently, and this map needs some updating, but currently Aspects has been used through various consultancies that I have been engaged in and presentations and conversations and research projects in all 5 continents across the globe. And we've been very privileged to be invited to explore how Aspects can be applied to different building typologies, different scales, from the interior and furniture all the way up to the cities and urban, and also had the opportunity to engage with advocates, self-advocates, autistic individuals, autistic communities themselves in many different typologies. And I feel very privileged to have had this opportunity. So to walk through what the Aspects principles are just in a very practical sense. The first principle is acoustics. And I recall one of the very first surveys that we sent out as part of that early 2001 research. We sent out an international survey to parents of children on the spectrum and asked them to list what they felt, what were the most impactful elements from the built world that influenced their children's behavior. And it was a very long, as our research always is, it was a very long, in-depth, detailed survey. And I remember one parent responding to me with just 3 words. She didn't answer any of the questions. She just said acoustics, acoustics, acoustics. In her mind, that was the only and the most important, and it overrides everything else from the architectural world, that acoustics was the primary element that she wanted us to think about. And I just want to clarify here, what Aspects requires us to think about is not the quietening of spaces. So it isn't about eliminating sound entirely, but it's about curating sound, and it's also about mitigating damaging or overwhelming sound, and it's also about matching the level of sound and the information shared through that sound with the activity at hand. And one example is this image that you see on the right, which is actually the lobby of a healthcare space that I'm currently designing in the United States for an autism healthcare and research center. And the ceiling mounted installation above is materials that have been designed specifically not to just take all the sound out of the space, but to allow intelligibility. So they mask the high frequencies and the low frequencies, but allow for the frequency of voice. And the idea is to create an environment that is intelligible, so that when you enter a hospital environment, you're not overwhelmed by the noise, and that you're still able to hear and have conversation and listen to instruction. The next principle is spatial sequencing. And spatial sequencing is interesting because it asks us as designers to break down and analyze the behavior and the unfolding of the narrative of the behavior of people in space, and think about that as a story or as a little almost movie unfolding and a narrative within the space, and then to design spaces and their sequence to parallel and mirror that narrative and that story, so that as you move through the space, you're not moving abruptly through experiences, but you're moving in a sequenced and logical way to how you are intended to use the space. And that little short clip that I showed you is actually the spatial sequencing of an autism-friendly student center that we were involved in designing at Dublin City University. I see some of the people on the call are from Ireland. And at Dublin City, it's the world's first designated autism-friendly university, and I had the privilege to be involved in creating a design guide for them. And this student center takes you from the central mall. It's on the ground floor of a student dorm that is being built there. It takes you from the central mall that is very busy and loud and overwhelming through a transition space into a series of spaces that mirror how students will move and experience that environment. The next concept in aspects is escape. And the idea of escape, I'm actually now revising that word because it may come with a little bit of negative connotation. But at the time, it was presented as a spatial opportunity to step away from a sensory overwhelming environment. And I'll show you an example of what we've done with it and how we've researched the value of it. But what I advocate for is to make sure that in all of our spaces, we allow for that experience, that moment to step away when you're overwhelmed and to create this spatial infrastructure for that to happen. And where I'm finding, I know we're focusing today on schools, but where I'm finding that this can be particularly impactful is in healthcare environments, particularly when it's embedded into wayfinding systems, because one of the shocking statistics is the level of healthcare that autistic individuals are given and have access to is significantly lower than those of their peers, not because we don't want to care for them, but because the lack of access to these healthcare spaces and the barriers that the healthcare spaces create. One of those most important barriers research has shown us is the physical environment itself. Autistic individuals will delay care and delay a visit to a hospital because of the way the physical environment our hospitals are set up. And that delay of care will have impact on their health. And there are shocking numbers to support that claim. So one of the things that I'm exploring in my work is embedding these escape spaces as part of wayfinding strategies. And the same could be applied in school environments as well, to be part of those wayfinding systems. The next concept is compartmentalization. And compartmentalization is similar to zoning in that it asks us to organize space, but it asks us to organize spaces into these discrete compartments. Here is an example on a city street that surrounds Dublin City University, with this proposal that there would be a transition between the building line and the paving, but there would also be almost lanes with different speeds and different sensory qualities in a gradient that go from low speed to high speed to mirror the low stimulus to high stimulus that we see along any of our city streets. Compartmentalization also, of course, can be represented in the internal space of school environments. Here, this is an image of a school for autistic students that I was involved in designing at the Sharjah City for Humanitarian Services with Dar al Amran and Ma'mar Group. And here we took this idea of compartmentalization, even at a very small scale. So each of the activities, the group work, the one-on-one, the individual work, the escape space, the opportunity for the teacher's workspace, each of them had its discrete corner or discrete representation throughout the classroom environment, which was very important. The next principle is transition, and transition asks us to create the spatial infrastructure to allow for sensory regulation and sensory readjustment. If you think of the autistic experience possibly being one of constantly being bombarded with sensory input that is not necessary to what you need in order to be productive in your space, then sometimes as you move from one experience to another, you're going to need a moment to adjust. And I think all of us can relate to this. When we arrive to a meeting or to a conference and we're very rushed and we're late and we're coming off a train that was very noisy or walking through a station that was very overwhelming, and then we arrive and we have to immediately be ready to talk and converse and be brilliant in the work that we do. Sometimes you need just that moment to adjust, to go from that very sensory overwhelming experience to a very focused experience. And what Aspects calls for is to create the spatial infrastructure for that to happen. It can be a small seat for someone to just step away with a little bit of quiet. It can allow you to step away from the flow of people so you don't feel the burden of being in people's way and being a barrier. And it can take on very different forms. This is another piece of work that we did as part of a healthcare environment, but I include it here because it could just as easily be part of a school environment, to create these alcoves of space where students or patients, as they're moving through a central corridor before they're expected to move into their next activity. Perhaps they're arriving from the playground and then have to go into a class where they're going to be taking an exam. And to give them that moment to be able to sit on a comfortable seat in a different level of lighting with some carpeting on the floor where it's quieter, just to readjust and sensory regulate and prepare themselves before they move into that high focus, low stimulation experience can be tremendously helpful. And it could take on lots of different forms and colors. The next example is this idea of sensory zoning. And here you see the same video running of the spatial sequencing, because in parallel to that spatial sequencing of movement from one activity to the next in a logical order, it must also be organized in a sensory order. So ideally, as architects, we are encouraged to think of our spaces and organize them through the functional lens. So we do functional zoning. We put offices next to offices, classrooms get next to classrooms, hospital bedrooms, patient rooms next to hospital patient rooms, and so on and so forth. So we think through the function of the space. I'm not asking us to abandon that utilitarian thinking, because it's absolutely important and central to good design, but I'm asking us to layer on top of it an element of the sensory. So perhaps not all classrooms are the same. Perhaps some classrooms require high focus and are low stimulation, and other classrooms are more engaging and stimulating, like music and drama and movement and physical education. Those types of classrooms are high stimulation, and then there may be other classrooms that are low stimulation. So it's really important to, in addition to through all the other lenses of good design, to think through the lens of the sensory. The last principle is this idea of safety. And I think safety is absolutely crucial, and it layers on to so many architectural decisions that we make, choices of materials, abilities, sight lines in schools, that we're able to see our students at all times, that students are not alone in spaces unsupervised or with an individual that may be harmful to them, but also hierarchy of control zones, that we make sure that the control points to our schools and out of our schools are controlled in a way, but that we're careful that it is not institutionalized, because we don't want students to feel that they're in a prison. We do want them to feel that, however, that they're protected and safe, and that parents feel safe leaving their children in our care in our schools, and that they are not at risk of elopement. Elopement is a big challenge with some children on the spectrum. Elopement is students wanting to run away. The moment they see an open door, an open corridor, or an open sidewalk, they'll dash out very quickly. And that is something that can be very, very dangerous. So the idea of safety, of course, is something that can be never be ignored. And I promised Suzanne today that I would talk about the Autism Friendly University Design Guide, but the reason I present it here is because it is a really great example of how all of these principles come together in a very practical and implemented way. So at the Dublin City University, we were invited to come in to design a guide for them to think about their future spaces, but also to design 3 test cases that would then take all of these aspects, principles, and put them into action across the campus. One of the first things that we designed was this autism-friendly communal space. And the selection of where it was located, I think, is very important. A lot of us want to create these autism-friendly environments within our schools, but sometimes tucking them away can be stigmatizing. So what we wanted to do was to make sure that it was centrally placed on the central mall, and that it became a showcase showcase of what an autism-friendly space looks like. And through the transition space, you see those circular cubbies in the wall, some accessible from the outside, some accessible from the inside as transition spaces. The first encounter after transitioning from the outside environment to the inside environment is this social space where students would be invited to come together, maybe have a short guest talk, but you'll see that the space is carpeted and it has acoustical tiles above to help capture the sound. And then as the students move through the different zones of that autism-friendly social space, the culmination of it was this whole refuge sensory regulation space that would have hammocks, would have hanging chairs, would have customizable moldable foam carpeting so that people could mold the shape of the space or the shape of the chair into the shape of their body. And it would be a place for not only autistic students, but any student to benefit from this autism-friendly design. Above in the autism-friendly dorms that we helped conceptualize are a series of autism-friendly bedrooms for residential support of students on campus. So since independent living is such a challenge for students in general, but particularly for autistic students, it was important for us to make sure that the dorms on campus included a series of autism-friendly bedrooms. And here is a good example of the scaling of compartmentalization. So even though it was a tiny student rooms are never big, we still managed to be able to create 4 discrete compartments: a study space, a sleep space, a storage space, and a bathroom space. And all within a very small footprint. We were still able to create that sense of containment in the bedroom because you don't want the distraction of sleep when you're studying or the distraction of demands of studying when you're trying to sleep. And with a simple compartment to break that line of sight, we felt that it would be helpful to create those compartments for the students so that they could truly use those spaces to recharge and regenerate their needs while they were on campus. Another interesting thing that we did at DCU was 2 things that this diagram shows. One was to create what I call an escape-scape, which is a network or a landscape of escape spaces dotted across a campus, a city, a school, a hospital, a whole series of moments to allow people to escape from the sensory overload. It can be just an individual chair that hugs you and wraps around you. It can be a small bench under a tree off of a pathway hidden by some shrubs. It can take on all sorts of different forms, but it's important that those escape spaces are distributed equally enough across the space so at any time someone moving through these complex, sometimes overstimulating spaces has a moment to step away. The second tactic that this diagram shows is what we call the sensory pathway, which is the dotted blue line that you see weaving around the campus. And the idea of the sensory pathway was actually an inspiration from a student, one of the students, the autistic students on campus that was kind enough to give me her insights and to walk with me virtually through the campus to share her sensory experience on campus. Her name is Milena Larsson. She's since graduated from Dublin City University, but during her time there and with our work together, she shared with me that she didn't use the main central spine, the main central mall, that all the students used to get from one point of campus into their different classes while she was on the main Glasnevin campus at DCU. She actually had found a series of hidden pathways, walkways, service entrance, bicycle paths, in between spaces between buildings that she had woven together to get herself from one point to another on campus so that she could avoid the overwhelming crowds and stimulation of that central mall that was very dense in the moments between classes when all the students were rushing and it was very crowded. So she had figured out this little pockets of little shortcuts that she could get quietly and more privately between where she needed to go. So we decided to embrace that and connect it across all of campus and create an entire sensory pathway. The other tactic that we proposed on campus was what we called the escape space or the quiet space, which has since been constructed. It was a small alcove in the Henry Grattan Student Center, very close to where the Autism Friendly Initiative is offices are housed. So students on the spectrum were coming to this building. We wanted to create for them a little pocket of space that was theirs, that they could escape to. It has since been built. I was just in a meeting this morning with people at DCU. We were putting together an exhibition at DCU to reflect on that work and other work that I'll show you shortly. But it is so far an extremely successful space that allows students just to step away from that overwhelming environment of the university campus. And these types of tactics are things I use and propose in almost all the projects I do. These images are from a workshop I recently did at the ELS for Autism School in Jupiter, Florida, the ELS for Autism Foundation, I apologize, the ELS for Autism Foundation campus that houses on it a charter school that provides services for the autistic experience. And these were perhaps the most popular of all the images and tactics that we showed them. The simple introduction of these types of alcoves throughout any kind of space dedicated for the autistic experience can be incredibly helpful. I'm happy always to see that other architects are also adopting the work that we propose. This is from the work of 6 Foot Studio that is headed by Matthew Tabram, who created a proposal for a school in London in a similar way, embedding this idea of wayfinding navigation along corridors, including these alcoves of escape dotted throughout the schools throughout the school space for self-regulation and withdrawal in a way that is very helpful. And Matthew and I have had conversations about how the aspects, principles have informed the work that he presented there. Aspects is also not just a tool to design new buildings, because I know there are a lot of us on this call that perhaps have schools of our own that we work in or have designed schools that perhaps it's too late for us to go back and start from scratch. So we may want to measure and assess what we've currently done in order to know how autism friendly they are. So we did something like this in 2000, I believe, 14. We looked at 5 schools from around the world. This is the Western Autistic School by Paul Heed and Maria Heed, architects in Australia. They also designed another wonderful school called the Northern School. And we looked at these schools and assessed their autism friendliness. We also had the opportunity to design at the Sharjah City for Humanitarian Services and look at the alignment of the wayfinding strategies there with the lighting and wayfinding tactics of aspects. This is the Center for Autism in Abu Dhabi, designed by my friend Simon Humphreys. And again, a lot of the aspects principles here were aligned in that there was a lot of transition. It's almost like a building within a building. It's a very beautiful design that Simon has done, that is a building floating within a building that does so many things, protects from the environment of Abu Dhabi that is a very, very harsh desert environment, dust, wind, sand, heat. So that double skin is very interesting, but what it also does is it creates these interstitial spaces of transition that's so wonderful. And the wayfinding navigation and the smoothness of it and the creation of transitions really aligned with the aspects index. This Autism Center in Missouri was designed with SFS architecture and BSA life structures, and myself, Studio TM. We created a whole wayfinding system that weaves through this Autism Research Center that allows the individuals, once they enter at this point of entry and check in, can start moving through the space following what we call this stream. So these visual cues on the floor will allow the autistic patients to track and be able to follow the stream to their therapy appointments. And this is, again, a tactic that can be easily employed in a school environment. You can color code it, you can texture code it so that students can find their way through to maybe the kindergarten, primary school, or the high school, or to the gym and recreation spaces, or to the cafeteria in a way that is logical and follows a certain sequence and concept. This is the Northern School of Autism by, again, Heed architects. Here they use this central space that opens up onto all the classrooms to allow for that transitioning between the different sensory zones of the school in a very beautiful and effective way. the analysis and assessment of all of these schools was summarized through a series of surveys and also a series of aspects assessment that I performed to score the schools. And the objective of this research was to look at, is there an alignment between the aspects criteria and the school participants' self-reporting of autism friendliness? So we asked the school leadership, the parents, the teachers, and some of the students to score the quote-unquote autism friendliness of their school as they perceived it, and looked for alignments between that and between the actual aspects criteria and level of alignment with that the schools were following. And we found a very high correlation between those two, which was an interesting proof of concept for us that the aspects criteria actually do or can create autism friendliness in schools. Another way that the aspects tools are being used are through post-occupancy evaluation and retrofit. And again, here I go back to the ELS Center for Excellence in Jupiter, Florida, that I was just visiting back again a few months ago. They are a phenomenal organization. They have on their campus independent charter school that operates on their campus. And I had the privilege to help work with them and think about how the architectural environment that they had built for that school could be utilized and deployed in a way that would help maximize the functionality of the school. So the primary school had already been built. The high school was still under construction when I did this post-occupancy assessment. But what we did is we broke down the school environment into these modules of space and looked at different spatial organizations for small group work, for individual one-on-one interventions, for alternative escape space, for large group configurations, and produced a series of modules that the teachers could then go in and almost like a puzzle, mix and match to create the layout of their classroom. So they would have a library of these modules that they could then pick and choose from and piece together to create their classroom environment or the ideal classroom environment depending on their needs. And I generated for them a series of templates that the teachers could then draw from. So they had a traditional stereotypical classroom layout, and they had certain prototypes of furniture that they already had in place. And from that library of pieces, we were able to come up and template a series of classroom arrangements that different teachers utilized in different ways. We went back a year later and assessed how it was that the teachers used them in both the primary school and the upper high school. And I went back a year later and was able to visit and assess myself, as well as through a survey, in what way complying with the modules helped the classrooms, or for the classrooms that didn't follow the modules, whether there was an impact or not. So again, we were using a proof of concept to try and align and see if an aspects compliant classroom is actually a better classroom for students' performance within it. We also introduced a color scheme throughout the wayfinding because there were some wayfinding challenges in the school because the school was designed in a very symmetrical way. So as you're moving through the school, you can get turned around and not be oriented to which wing of the school that you're on. So we introduced color scheming, and that color scheming has been carried out. Interestingly, on my visit back in November, I became aware of the fact that they also use it as a safety recall communication. So if there's a crisis that's happening in one of the school corridors, they can call over the walkie-talkie that talks to all of the teachers and all of the staff and say, we have a student that's in crisis and in need in the blue corridor. So they can immediately go to the right space. So they're using this color scheming to communicate for safety concerns as well. So in the post-occupancy, so we did one post-occupancy of the existing school to propose the design interventions. The design interventions were then implemented, and we went back a year later and did a post-occupancy to see the impact of those design interventions on the school. And these are just a snapshot of some of the results. So to the question of the compliance with the template that was provided, so if you use the template, were your students more focused? Were the students less distracted? Were the resources more organized? Was the classroom more visually less distracting? Did the students demonstrate less behavioral issues, and so on and so forth? So we had very positive responses for those classrooms that were aspects compliant. The students did show more organization, more focus, and being on task. Another really interesting intervention that we introduced were what we famously called the purple pods. And you see here in this photograph, the director of the school working in one of these purple pods. We introduced these as transition spaces throughout the school. And they weren't designed for this purpose, by the way. These are little conferencing couches, and they are designed for workplace environments. They're designed for conference centers. But what was interesting to us is they had this acoustical treatment around their edges. And even though they're small and not very deep, but the moment you tuck into and sit down into one of them, you get this hush of sound, which was very effective. So we put them in place so that the students would have a place to drop into and transition as they were arriving in the morning, or arriving from playground recess, or arriving from maybe PE or a music class or an art class where they're very overstimulated and being asked to immediately step into the classroom and start on their work. These transition pods gave them that moment to adjust. And what you see here, that they're also being used by the staff, because the staff moving from one classroom to another, doing observations or testing or assessments, those of you, if there are any teachers on or principals or therapists that embed in classrooms on this call, you'll know that one of the things you need is just a moment to sit down with a notebook or a laptop to take your notes before you rush off to the next thing, because you don't have time to go to your office and it's too loud or noisy or inappropriate for you to take those notes while you're on the go. So you just need a few minutes of silence and a focus to make those notes or prepare yourself before it is that you're going into the classroom. What was most interesting of the impact of the purple pods is that 50% of the responses said that they were used for their purpose of moving from high stimulation to low stimulation. A little over 80% said that they were using them for escape from sensory overload, which was what they were intended to do. But over 80% and 40% respectively said that they were being used for positive reinforcement and reward time and for social interaction. And I just want to unpack that a little bit. Those of you that are familiar with the foundational pedagogical principles of supporting children on the spectrum in their learning know that positive reinforcement is a central tool to being able to reward and reinforce certain positive behaviors. So when you break down, say you're teaching a child how to hold a pencil appropriately so they can start learning to write. Every time they hold the pencil correctly, you give them a positive reinforcement. It can be a sticker, it can be a word, but by reinforcing that behavior time and time again, ultimately you'll be able to hopefully internalize the appropriate small motor coordination of holding a pencil appropriately, so that that is the first step to them being able to learn to write. So positive reinforcement finds its way into every learning experience in supporting autistic skill development. So it's so important. But what we found is that these purple pods, students themselves were starting to ask teachers to allow them time in the purple pods as a reward. They saw these purple pods as such a positive space and a helpful space for them to be in, that they saw it as a treat. They saw it as a reward, and they were actually asking for it. This idea came from students. It didn't come from teachers. So even when I came back for that post occupancy evaluation, I had a moment in the classroom where I saw a student, after they had done their task successfully, signal with their card that they wanted their iPad and they wanted time to go sit in the purple pod to be able to do private work or to play or to just have a moment away from everything else. And we thought that that was such a great, almost accidental result of a value for these kinds of spaces. The other point of social interaction was also very interesting. And again, those of you who work with autistic children know that a lot of times social interaction can be a challenge, and initiating social interaction can be a little bit scary for someone who is on the spectrum. So the hallway environment in schools is a very social environment. When you go to typical schools, that's where students see each other from different classes. That's where they meet teachers from their previous years. It's a very social space. That circulation space isn't just about getting from point A to point B. It's where all the social capital is built. It's where all the social experiences are happening. And that can be a challenge for someone on the spectrum. But what we began observing by just having these purple pods in place, as the students stepped into them, they became comfortable enough to initiate that social interaction. So while they're in the pod and maybe their teacher from last year walks by, they'll call them over, "Hey, Mr. Toby, it's nice to see you today." And any parents, again, or teachers or autistic individuals themselves on this call will know that sometimes that's a little bit of a challenge for some people to do. So the safety of that purple pod gave them the opportunity to do that. And of course, it goes without saying that aspects, and the best case scenario for us is to be able to take the aspects principles in a generative way and be able to design a school ourselves using the aspects principles. So this is the Sharjah City for Humanitarian Services. This was the WEFA school that we were involved in. The SCHS is a really interesting organization, and this prospective speculative project is incredibly ambitious. It was an entire neighborhood of 1 million square feet of museums and hotels and residential. It was an entire multi-use development that on its premises was going to be a school for autism, a school for the deaf, inclusive library, museum, hotel, sports complex. It was a really ambitious, beautiful project. I'll just focus a little bit right now on the autism school. In the campus of the school, central to it was this wonderful sensory playground where students could play, could have different sensory experiences, but also was a sensory garden where we deployed all the elements of the multisensory, a herbal garden, different textures and touch, different pathways, different movements, different vestibular and proprioceptive stimulation that was so important to that experience and allowed students to transition and to get that sensory input, whether it was sensory seeking or sensory avoiding. That sensory playground allowed it for them. The wayfinding system, again, with this idea of some sort of pathway that students could follow, some integration of daylight and the compartmentalization of the classrooms. Again, this goes back to Matthew Tabram's 6-foot studio school that was designed based on the aspects principles of compartmentalization, of sensory zoning, of breaking spaces down rather than having big centralized universal open plan spaces, to break it down into discrete compartmentalized spaces that were more manageable, to again build in and hardwire these escape spaces as part of the overall wayfinding system of the school, and to make sure that the school was zoned in that gradient from the low stimulation to high stimulation, and allowing the transitioning that would happen in between, that in some cases could be done through green spaces and landscape, to allow that interstitial buffer between the school and where the school meets its community, to have that important transition space. I want to leave you with some thoughts of how we ourselves can use these different ideas. And I know that many architects, through our attempts to be human-centered and user-friendly, do a lot of what we call user engagement. And that is incredibly helpful and incredibly supportive and inclusive. However, a lot of times the classical tools that we use for user engagement can be themselves very exclusionary and not very accessible to the autistic experience, because we typically use things like design thinking visual workshops, or we use interviews that are very socially based, or we used focus groups that are very verbally based. And all of those can be a challenge for individuals on the spectrum. And we worked over a series of years to develop what we ultimately call the autism-friendly design thinking approach. It began with the As I Am organization, which is an autism self-advocacy group. Again, my Irish friends on the call may be familiar with the wonderful work that Adam Harris and his colleagues do at As I Am, we were invited to run a workshop at the As I Am International Conference in 2019, right before COVID, September 2019. We did this typical design thinking exercise, and because it was so oversubscribed, it became a very overwhelming environment for the autistic individuals in the room. So as again, working with As I Am later on, when we worked on the autism-friendly university at Dublin City University, completely by coincidence, in a forced social experiment, we had to run a similar workshop, but now we had to do it virtually because it was during COVID shutdown. So what we had done in Dublin originally live in person, we then did for the Dublin City University a very similar workshop, but we did it using a mural board and a virtual environment. And interestingly, what we found when we ran that is that immediately those that had participated in the in-person workshop and those that had participated in the remote workshop came to me and told me they far preferred the remote version because they could zoom in and focus on a single place or a single space. They could edit out all the visual environment and focus perhaps only on one thing. The timing of it, they weren't under stress being asked to come up with an idea to put on the wall immediately in the moment. They could go back to our virtual board later and add more thoughts. They could choose different ways to communicate to us. They could raise their hand in the Zoom and communicate like I am right now, visually and verbally on the screen. They could turn their camera off. They could mute themselves. They could lower the volume of people if the people were yelling or the sound was too loud. They could write something in the chat, or they could put it on the mural board. And even on the mural board, they could choose to sketch something, or they can choose to type something in on the sticky note. So it was just so diverse in the way that they could choose to engage that it was far more successful. I've since gone back and done many other different types of engagements with different people, but the ultimate result of all of that is this design thinking autistic perspective, which is being able to create predictability, being able to create something that's very scheduled, making sure that there is what I call the autistic social space, so that the individuals on the spectrum that are part of your workshop feel comfortable engaging in a way that they have control, that it's more personal as opposed to social. So maybe there are some individuals where you have to do an independent one-on-one or a smaller focused group rather than a big social workshop. So just to customize the experience so that you make sure that the individuals on the spectrum are truly included. And I think this work that the field is seeing around human-centered design thinking needs to have a neurodiverse lens, because when we say we are being human-centered as architects, I'm finding that largely what people actually mean is they have a very defined identity and profile of who that body is at the center of that circle. It is largely able-bodied, neurotypical, seeing, hearing, moving, male, 6'2", English speaking. So there's a lot of assumptions we make about this body in the center of human-centered, and very rarely is that description autistic or neurodivergent. So through my work, I like to try and expand who that person is at the center and make sure that that experience can be included in the processes that we use to claim to engage users. I want to make sure that the language that we use when we do these types of activities is very specific, and we have multiple points of communication. And also we leave space for people to dream around what it is that is their ideal space. And I'm going to leave you with just a few very quick thoughts of how we situate this within the larger world. Our environments are so overstimulating and such a sensory overload. And the work that we've recently been doing, when you do create a little moment of escape, can be so effective that when we create these experiments, this is an experiment that we conducted at the Venice Biennale, where we created a simulation of an environment that was sensory overloading, sensory overwhelming. And as a result of that simulation, you were invited then to step into that little red escape space. And the people engaging in that space were later surveyed, and we found very interestingly that both the autistic experience and the neurotypical experience both benefited from that moment of autistic escape, that moment to step away from the sensory overload. So my hope is that in our conversation that we're about to kick off right now, we can think together about specific ways these 15 principles of aspects can start finding their way into the work and how we think about our school environment so that they can be more inclusive of the autistic experience.
So thank you very much. And I can see some have written some questions in the chat, and you have to raise your hand so we know. Oh, we have a lot of people who want to say something now. I'd like to start with a question that when I read about your research, I was so impressed that you had a lot of, or several students with autism that you had in your work group, so you could know from them what they preferred and so on. Perhaps you would like to say a little about that, and I will note who would like to ask other questions.
Of course, happily, Suzanne. And I think that's also something that I'm personally very committed to and proud that I have the opportunity and very privileged to have the opportunity to work with so many individuals themselves on the spectrum. And I'm often surprised when I work with schools or workplace environments or hospitals or universities when they come to me and they say, we'd like to get your expert opinion on how we should design X. And my first question is, have you asked your autistic students how they would like to see it designed? And many times clients are surprised that I'm asking them this question, but I think that should always be the starting point. And I think autism should be at the center of our design decision-making when we're designing for autism. There's a famous saying in the autism and disability design world, nothing about us without us. How can you design something about us if you don't even ask us? And so many of the insights of our work, I think of myself, I know sometimes people will present me as a design expert. I don't think of myself as an expert. I think of myself as someone who's had the privilege to be in a position as an architect with the tools of architecture to observe and learn from the autistic experience and just being able to turn it into architectural form. So specific examples of what you're mentioning, Suzanne, I think the Autism Friendly University Design Guide is an excellent example of that. The idea of it came from the autistic experience from As I Am, which is an autism self-advocacy group. Their CEO, Adam Harris, himself is on the spectrum. The majority of their employees and members are individuals on the spectrum. They were the inspiration for the Autism Friendly University initiative. So it began with the autistic voice. And throughout the entire process, they were central. They were participants in the workshops. So at the starting point of the work was autism voice. The research method was informed by the autism voice, and also the product itself was peer-reviewed by autistic architects, designers, students, adults themselves. So in scholarship, we also always say we're going to send our work out to experts to peer review. In this case, my experts were the autistic individuals that were using the space themselves. And I think this is so important. And I think we need to move from autism as subject, as if we're studying it as a subject, or autistic as an object, as if we're observing it as an object, to autism as the expert, and to learn from the autistic experience. And that's kind of the projection or the trajectory that my work has taken over the past 20 years.
Thank you very much. I saw some hands up and then they disappeared. Someone who would like to comment on this or I cannot see any hands in the air. Anyone who would like? I have a comment here from Thomas Söderlund. He writes, as a parent of autistic children, you work together with the school to identify strategies that these children can use to cope with difficult situations. These children develop by being able to use these strategies over time. Have you taken this into account when developing autistic architecture? How the environments we create may need to look like in lower ages and how they can look like in older ages. That was his comment on your...
Right. Well, thank you, Thomas, for sharing that. And I think this is such an important thing that children are taught, and our schools and parents work so hard to teach children coping mechanisms to how they can handle these kind of overwhelming, I don't know specifically what you're referring, but I'm assuming overwhelming situations that could be challenging for them. The way I've taken this into consideration is to, as an architect and designer, I'm not a therapist. I can't claim to understand how to identify or teach these coping mechanisms. But what I can do as an architect is to understand what the triggers are of these challenges. So my responsibility in a situation like this would be to understand what is it, is there an environmental element and trigger that is contributing to this challenging behavior, and work with the coping strategies. So let me think of a hypothetical example. For example, if a certain sound, so there was a school that I was designing where a child was having problems with toileting and wetting themselves because they didn't want to use the toilet that was in the classroom, because the toilet that was in the classroom had a motion sensor light and a motion sensor fan, and every time they walked in, the fan would go on and the lights would go on, and it was very startling for the child. So they would hold it and they wouldn't use the toilet when they needed it. And so the teachers were training them how to maybe manage their toileting in a better way. My job there was to identify that it was the motion sensor that was the problem. And if we could have either just a typical light switch, like the one the child had at home that they were more comfortable with, or if the fan was on a manual switch that the teacher could turn on after the child had used the restroom, not the moment the child entered the restroom, then that fan sound that was a very noisy fan, there was a rattling, it wasn't installed properly, so it was very upsetting for the child. Once we identified that environmental trigger, my job as a designer is to mitigate that challenge happening in the first place. Of course, challenges will always happen, and not all challenges will be because of something in the environment. They could be something social, could be something behavioral. So, but at least creating the environment that minimizes that the challenges happen, that's how I take that into consideration. And to the second part of the question about lower ages and older ages, the way I'm thinking about the lifespan of autism is to make sure that we have design strategies throughout that lifespan. So one parent once shared with me that she was so frustrated because every conversation she was having around her teenage son's needs almost assumed, and I will quote her here, she said, it almost assumed that my son was going to evaporate at the age of 18, that once he graduated school, he would no longer exist. And no one was talking to her about what was going to happen when he graduated from high school. Where was he going to go? Where was the program that was going to support him? And this was before there were wonderful institutions like Dublin City University and the Autism Friendly University. So, this kind of thinking about the lifespan of services. So it's not just school environments, it's higher education environments, it's workplace environments, it's residential environments, it's city environments, it's senior living environments, so that we have a lifespan of at least the physical environmental support, so that hopefully our children can grow and become as independent as possible and have the support that they need throughout the lifespan.
Okay, Thomas Söderlund has shown hand. Would you like to comment on this? Thomas Söderlund, activate your...
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I will try it in English. It's it's easier on Swedish. But yes, I have a child, an autistic child, and he's adult today, and we have had quite a journey through school with his to get the environment that he has needed. And I can say so much that, for example, he has developed a lot over the years, and we have worked a lot with strategies to cope with difficult situations, and in cooperation with the teachers we have made it work. But an autistic child can develop and can cope with more difficulties over time as he gets older. But in the lower ages, for example, one big task was to be able to förflyttningar, maybe someone can... Movements around the school, and also get the right material with him to different places in the school was very difficult. And the solution we made, it was instead of that the children in the school was moving around all the time, the teachers moved around. Mm-hmm. And that was a very big success. And I think it's for autistic children, it could be very important to think about in the lower ages to work with environments that are that handle these difficulties. It's an example.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it's an excellent example. One of maybe I didn't get into the details of the external ring of the Aspects 2.0, but one of the principles of that is what we call operation, and it asks designers to think about, so spatial sequencing asks us to organize spaces close together so that the child wouldn't have to move all over the school to go from one class to another. So it's almost like mapping this child's schedule. So if they arrive and then they have some time in the classroom with their group, and then they maybe go to the library for some reading and so on and so forth. So you take their schedule and then you just cluster those activities together so they're close and they're easy to navigate, especially for the younger ages. So that's one thing you can do. But the other thing you can do is to think about, how do I then operate the school? Because I can design those in that organization, but if they then schedule the students that way, then they'll still be jumping around the school and having challenges moving from very far classrooms to another, and then being distracted and having to move long distances. So the suggestion of operating that it's the teachers that move, not the students that move, is a brilliant solution and a great example of how operation and design can work together. I think a lot of times schools clients are surprised when I design with the architectural plan a school schedule. So I tell them, this is how this building is designed to be used, and this is how the schedule of the day should run. You should organize these activities earlier in the morning, so when the students arrive, and those are the activities that are close to the arrival point, and so on and so forth. So I agree with you, Thomas, completely, that the idea of shifting, it's not all about design. And a lot of times we put so much responsibility on the autistic child to cope and have the coping, when we shouldn't. We should make the environment less of a problem to need to cope with to begin with.
May I say one thing just to what you just said? This is very important because the energy level of these children is a hard task to. you must have the energy level to cope with the things that the children must do at school, and therefore it's very important to take away things that you can take away, so they can have the energy for the important schoolwork.
Absolutely.
Yes,
you.
thank you.
Okay, we have Marta Berkovic would like to say something, ask a question or comment.
Yes, exactly. Hello, Magda. Thank you so much for the presentation. I wasn't following from the very beginning. And Susanne, it's always lovely to see you. I just have one comment and one question. I think we shouldn't forget that, and I'm saying this as someone who has a PhD in school design, neurodivergent principles, whenever applied, they're good for everyone. And
Exactly.
it's not just, these spaces are very comfortable, not just for children on the neurodivergency spectrum. They're good and very pleasant for everyone. So we should also think, a bit more broadly. It's also contributing to our understanding of what architecture and design is. So it's not just targeting one specific population, it's applicable for everyone. I just wanted to make this comment, and then I wanted to ask you one question. As someone who is coming from research and using quite a lot of games to include children and young people, what I see as a challenge, and so far we have not been able to solve that, when you would like to have a validated research result, it's very hard to organize the research process and methods and tools, exactly because of the thing you said. So you have one question or one way of answering question, but actually this is not very convenient and very useful for everyone. So how did you go about that, being in a way and doing your post-occupancies, being a researcher who has to produce some kind of validated outcome, but then on the other hand, not being able to, or seeing that offering just one way, one tool, one methodology to a very diverse group of youth is actually not working. Could you comment on that for me? That would be really interesting. Thank you.
Sure. I think that's so important, Marta. And so two things. The first, I think, is to be very transparent and realistic about the limitations of the research that we're able to do. Architectural research is such a difficult thing to work on because the variables are just so tremendous. And if you want to be truly authentic about the individuals that are participating in your research and mindful and respectful of their diversity, you really have to almost customize tools for each person, particularly when you're getting into the more neurodivergent populations that you and I maybe are working in. So the way I go about it really is just being explicit about there are limitations to being able to validate these results because you cannot use the same method and tool for every participant. And that's one challenge. The other challenge is you need such a big data set. So let's assume that I'll be able to find enough of a data set of number of participants that are comfortable with interview or that are comfortable with survey or that we can observe. It's just such a big undertaking. It's doable, of course, and feasible, but sample size is always a challenge as well. Another challenge is consent. Because many of these individuals are children. They're children that you can't necessarily make an abstract consent or verbal consent of. Parents are understandably very protective of their children and may not be open to giving consent as they would on other typical school environments, and I completely understand and respect that. So navigating consent in a way that is respectful and safe for everyone who's participating is also a challenge. But one of the things I've been engaged in personally, and Suzanne and I have both been involved in the recent International Union of Architects World Congress. One of the things that we did in our work there about designing for inclusivity, I think the world of scholarship needs to change and be more expansive. And as important it is, and I don't want to be misunderstood here, scientific rigor is the foundation of advancement. We have to be able to know what is fact, and we have to be able to know what is true and to validate and verify that. But holding every piece of investigation to that extremely high standard of that type of or the methods that people use. So there are so many times that I've been confronted working on neurodiversity where a reviewer will say, you should have done the method, the tool that would have been more appropriate for this question would have been an interview, not realizing that we're dealing with a nonverbal community. So the fact that they want to apply a neurotypical normative set of rules to a population that perhaps those rules are not appropriate for becomes exclusionary, which means that there's research out there that is being excluded from publication and dissemination because it doesn't follow these normative neurotypical standards of research practice, which I think are important and necessary. I just think they need to be expanded to include these mixed methods that we have to use, these smaller sampling that we have to use, these secondary resources that we have to use, that we need to maybe perhaps interview the proxy, not the individual themselves. There are things that we can do to get information that may not be at that highest standard, but I think it's still valuable and useful. And again, being transparent, not claiming that the statistics that come out of a survey are necessarily fact. These are just the opinion of the people that answered the survey. And we need to be able to contextualize that. But I don't think it should be a barrier to allowing perhaps softer forms of research, because behind every data point is a story. And I think that's maybe where my work is more in that space of the story behind the data point. Because not always everything can be captured in that limited, narrow vision of what is scientific fact.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. This was very reassuring that I'm not the lone fighter, because trying to make peace between us as architects and having this creative mind with it, approaching to develop these kind of tools is one thing, but then of course that's not accepted. It's something that's scientifically valid, and then very often through research projects you would like to tackle some of these questions, but this is still the disparity. Yeah, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Would you, Christina, please put off your camera? Christina, could you please put off your camera? Okay, we have a question from Anna Ellingsen. Thank you, Christina.
Yes, hello, Magda. Super interesting lecture. As an architect of schools and mother of an autistic child, this was right up my alley, and I am with you all the way. I just had, see if I can remember my question. This was so interesting, so I kind of lost my trail of thought. But I was wondering, yes, because I'm a bit interested in your international experience of building schools and the organization in different countries, because I'm sure it's true for many countries, but in Sweden we have a very high level of integration of autistic children in regular schools, and they're on a very broad spectrum. Like they have to be very, very autistic and large learning disabilities to be eligible for special education. And that can be a bit of a challenge, because we have right now a lot of children that are pupils in schools that are not very adapted to autistic design. I was just interested in what it's like in the rest of the world, if you have any thoughts or experiences of the inclusive kind of education for autistic children contra special schools.
I think that's such an excellent question and a very interesting one, Anna. I'm privileged to be able to work in these different cultures. I think I'll answer the question in a few ways. So first of all, it's a cultural question. So for each of these communities, they will have a cultural definition of responsibility and infrastructures of care that is responsible for these children. So in some parts of the world, this is still seen through a very medical model. So autism is still pathologized and seen as a responsibility of the Ministry of Health and hospitals. And it's interesting, I've been asked to design what clients have called a hospital with therapy spaces, but actually architecturally it's a school, because they think of all therapy and intervention are still thinking in the older, more medicalized model. And then I would consider Sweden and the Nordic countries as very progressive in their thinking and have more of a social structure. So culturally, because of that way of thinking, education is seen as a basic human right that should be given to everyone, that's funded by the government, that's free and available at a very high quality for everyone. But along with that thinking of social democratization of something as basic as education, in a well-intentioned way, they see full integration as the highest aspiration. And I think these are two extreme examples. And I think the correct is somewhere a little bit in between, that is more supportive of. I work with different people, and one of the autistic adults that I've worked with has shared with me their frustration with the fact that because they have been so hyper included in everything, they have no opportunity to just be autistic anymore, a space where they can safely be themselves and just allow themselves to have what they need. And not always have the pressure of trying to cope and to fit in and to be part of, which is important. We don't, and I'm not advocating for stigmatization or separation or segregation, but what I'm advocating for is something like a hybrid model where, yes, schools should be integrated the opportunity to have access to everything for all citizens is very important, in my opinion. But I would prefer that it be seen as what I call a reverse inclusion model. So imagine if, rather than saying every autistic child is struggling to fit into the typical school systems in Sweden, if we were to design every school in Sweden to be supportive of the autistic experience, it would help support our autistic students, and it would help support our neurotypical students. Because as someone commented earlier, when you design with the autistic experience in mind, you design better for everyone, because the tactics that we talk about align with comfort and belonging for many different people. But within that, I think we also need to create, so rather than saying our only two choices are a special education school or a fully integrated school with minimal supports, we need to have a hybrid in between. We need to have a fully integrated school that has embedded within it some special education support that's customized for each child for what they need. And that goes back to your question about the different cultures. So for example, in the United States right now, because education and healthcare are separated, but then insurance, there's an economic context as well to all this. So there's a cultural context of who is responsible for what. In some countries, children under the age of 5 are the responsibility of the Ministry of Health, and then between the ages of 5 and 18, they're the responsibility of the Ministry of Education, and then 18 above, they become the responsibility of the Ministry of Labor if they're in labor and working, or Ministry of Higher Education, and so on and so forth. In the United States, for example, where I do a lot of work, the economic capitalist model is prevalent over everything. So if you have a child who has challenges, you are pushing to get that autism diagnosis, because with it, you get unlocked all this funding to help support them. That maybe isn't a challenge that you have in social democracies, because education is something that is a basic right that's provided to you regardless of diagnosis. So I'm not surprised to see that the diagnostic numbers are different, because there is this incentive in the United States to unlock any support for your child. You need a diagnosis, and to get that diagnosis, to get the insurance that will then pay for an aid or a shadow or a placement or a therapy. So there are just there are economic contexts, there are policy context? Is it Ministry of Health? Is it Ministry of Education? Who's responsible for my child's services? And then there's the cultural context of, do we see this child as different, or do we see this child as an equal member of society? Those are cultural differences that are just so vast from different parts of the world. I know that didn't answer the question.
It was interesting anyway, yes.
but I think I have a responsibility, because I'm asked this a lot, to maybe write this up in some, or map this out in some way, in some sort of map, to say how autism is perceived, how it is represented, what its statistics are in each of these different contexts from around the world.
I think if I can comment on that, sorry, Suzanne, just like lectures like these, and kind of pinpoint maybe the need of like transition spaces. Like there is a well-intentioned thought to integrate all the children, but because of the schools are not prepared to accept them, maybe your way in the middle at least should be a transition before full integration, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. I would like to give the question to Mo Saraf, and I would like you, Mo, to tell us and Magda about your research.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Magda, for the very, very interesting presentation and very inspiring line of work, actually, which has been always very, very helpful to me, and I'm sure to many others. It was not long ago that I was also listening to a podcast on Uniquely Human, if I remember correctly, and I was thinking that's really, really great, and it actually helped me very much to understand many of the reasonings behind the literature when I was reading. But also back to what Suzanne mentioned, I'm a researcher in urban planning, and I've been very much working on cultural diversity and the spatial justice and the right of different communities to the city. But very recently have changed the focus to autism or neurodiversity and their struggle or their right or their attempt or their like efforts for seeking justice and their right to the city. And this is exactly the area that I wanted to ask a question, but I'm not really sure if I can. Maybe I also need help to formulate the question, because I'm not really sure how I can say it. But to give you a background is that we as the architect, we could perhaps be a little bit of support to this community in their struggle for spatial justice or the right to the environment. But on the other hand, at the same time, both in our discipline and also in other disciplines, there's a trend to emphasize on digital world and its capacity to include this community in life. So although there is lots of point in that, but one implicit point is excluding this community actually from the real physical spatial environment with an excuse of referring to digital world, to the digital solution or digital participation or digital inclusion. So, and this has become a little bit difficult for coming up, for instance, even with design codes or any sort of reasoning for spatial interventions when it comes to the needs of this specific community. So my question is that how could we merge these two in a way that on the one hand, we acknowledge the capacity and the positive side of this digital world, but on the other hand, it doesn't become an implicit exclusionary way for when we are dealing with the real physical environment. I'm not sure if I managed to finally make my question or not, but please let me know if I need to add to this.
I think I understand what you're saying is that you're afraid that the digital is going to be used as an excuse not to do the real work of changing our cities and making them actually physically more accessible to this population. And I think one of the things that I find interesting when I work with urban planners or people that are thinking about the autism-friendly city, is when they say, well, we don't have a lot of autistic citizens, or we don't have a lot of autistic employees, or we don't have a lot of autistic students on our campus. And I tell them, have you ever thought that it's because your space is so poorly designed in support of their needs that they can't exist in these spaces, so they're not occupying them, that it's a self-selective process that you have designed. So just speaking about the importance of the autism-friendly city as a physical city, we just published a book called, it was originally called The Autism-Friendly City, and then ultimately was called Making Cities More Inclusive for the Autism Spectrum, with my colleagues at University of Sapienza in Rome. I can get you a link to the book if Suzanne is interested. But the idea is that we've made progress in creating autism-friendly buildings. So we have autism-friendly schools, we have autism-friendly hospitals, we have autism-friendly homes. But if I call them islands of accessibility in a sea of inaccessibility, if we don't have autism-friendly cities, then there's very little value of making my apartment autism-friendly and my workplace autism-friendly if it's so overwhelming for me to get from my apartment to my workplace that I end up missing a lot of work, even though once I get to the workplace, I'm perfectly capable. So our cities are becoming disabling of our autistic population because of this. It's the fabric in between everything that we're trying to put in place, and it's just so damaging and unraveling. I will refer to one experience I had with an autism self-advocacy group when they invited me to speak with them at the UN in Geneva at the Commission for the Rights of People with Disabilities, with the hopes that the CRPD would include some autistic guidance in similar to how it includes guidance for the deaf population and the blind population and the mobility challenged population. So I was invited to give this presentation with an autism self-advocacy group based in Europe, and the two gentlemen that were supposed to be presenting with me were themselves on the spectrum. One of them, after having lobbied for over 2 years to get this very short 30-minute audience with the UN Commission for the Rights of People with Disabilities, was unable to join the meeting because that morning, in his attempt to get, he was nervous, he was anxious because of this meeting that he had waited so long to set up, that he had a meltdown on the way in the train. And you're talking about Swiss trains in Geneva. This is not chaos. This is the most organized, the cleanest, most predictable mobility system in the world. And it was still too overwhelming for him and created so much of a barrier, he could not come to that meeting. And that was a problem of the autism friendliness of the city, even though it was at that high level of Swiss precision. So we have a responsibility to think of our cities of being autism friendly. And a lot of the things that we developed in the design guide for the campus can be applied up to the city scale. And that's what we tried to experiment with at the Biennale exhibition that I showed very quickly at the end. The experiment was that we simulated a city environment by crowdsourcing audio and video and visual materials from autistic individuals from all over the world. This is another example of working with autistic experiences themselves. So they created for me imagery and video that we displayed on the walls of the exhibit. And then we had a simulation of an escape space inside hanging in an installation. So you could step into it, into these quiet little spaces. And step away from this visual and auditory simulation of the city sensory overload. And the data that we gathered from this spatial experiment is that it was so helpful for both the autistic and the neurotypical populations to step away from that sensory overload of the city, that they left even that 1 or 2 moment experience less stressed, more calm, less agitated, more relaxed and focused. So if we can do that in under 2 minutes with a little curtain of sensory, of acoustical materials with a little chair, if you could have a whole network of those across a city, imagine what it could do for the autistic population to be able to just step away and have these sensory restoration spaces across the entire city. I'm exploring this in different places and spaces right now. But I hope to be working on it over this next couple of years to start designing what that would look like and how it would be built and designed and where it would be in and how we can engage the city and what kind of response we can get as a result. But I agree with you, Mo, that the digital engagement is not a proxy for in-person engagement. It can be a tool that can allow individuals to engage in a way that's more comfortable, like the example I showed of being able to engage in a workshop in a digital way, in a way that's more comfortable than doing it physically. But you're absolutely right. It shouldn't be an excuse to let people off the hook to create. It's not an excuse for us to create overstimulation everywhere, wherever we want, and just not have to worry about our artistic citizens because they can engage in their needs in the digital world. That's not enough.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I totally agree with you. And just to add some examples of what you mentioned, for instance, in Sweden, we currently have a sort of emerging trend of digitalization plus these sort of open space offices or activity-based offices, in a way that instead of having everyone has its own office or smaller room, it's in a like wider landscape of desk. And when it comes to the question, okay, what happens to for instance, autistic rights to the work environment? How could they, because these are obviously not really suitable for them. The first reasoning comes up is that, okay, they can work from home, they can get help of like all the digital tools to communicate with the colleagues, or even at schools could easily come up with an excuse that we do not have the physical, I'm talking about the usual schools, that we do not have the environment or the enough space to provide such spaces for kids on the spectrum. So this has become a little bit, at some point, I think, something that we in Sweden need to really look into it a bit more carefully when we're thinking of some specific groups, like, for instance, neurodiversity, perhaps as a community. But thank you so much for today and for answering my question.
Of course.
I was thinking about the importance of making very nice parks when you speak about the city and the towns, that we must, the landscape architects have a lot to do in this, I think.
Yes.
We have a new comment from Thomas Söderlund. He written a comment in the chat, but I give the word to Thomas and you can say it yourself.
Yes, I think it was Sanna who brought up the question, and I would like to share we are participating in a parent network, Barn i behov in Sweden, Children in Needs, and this is parents that have children with MPF diagnosis, and the statistics in Sweden hasn't been in place. It's undergoing, it's coming, but it's not here. But a network, another network have put in front statistics, and this inclusion we have made in Sweden, it came with a steering document that came 2011, and every special groups for these children were excluded, and the children was put in the ordinary classes and schools. And this has in practice led to the fact that many autistic children are now completely excluded. So the inclusion has led to excluding. Many are not in school. And we think from this network that the school must be adapted to the children's needs and not the other way around. And it's the case today in many cases. And the template that these children have to fit is very, very small today. And we know also that mental illness has increased a lot for these children, and it goes down in ages and 32% can't cope with school. And we know also that it's 6 times more common that these children are attempting suicide than it is for neurotypical children. So we have for these children we have a very difficult situation, and the schools where we are developed are very important, that we are developed them as good as we can, so we can make these children a good environment for these children in the ordinary school and classes. So I just wanted to comment on that the subject Anna brought up.
Right. And you're absolutely this idea of just inclusion all of a sudden without having the spatial infrastructure in place or the training in place to support that inclusion can be more damaging than anything else. So all I can say, Thomas, is that if there's anything I can do to help in support or advice or consultation or communication, conversation with any of these school organizations, I'd be more than happy. I think this is the whole point that Suzanne and I connected, is that how can we think about how we can bring this work to the schools in Sweden moving forward, whether it's through individual architects or whether it's at the policy level or whether it's at the school administration level, at case by case. But I think it's absolutely important that as designers, we're responsible for creating the background for these social environments that these children are put into. And if those environments are just making their exclusion and their mental health even worse because they are not authentically included, then we have a responsibility in that.
I would like to read one comment from Nina Moore, who is from Norway. Thank you for the work you do as a mother, sister, and grandma to autistic people, and as an interior architect who work mainly with schools. My biggest challenge in my work is the lack of knowledge and understanding I meet, especially amongst teachers and school leaders, on how to design the learning environment to attend the needs of the neurodiverse students. There is still a long way to go here in Norway anyway, she writes. So that's...
Well, I think that's not uncommon. I think it's not Norway only, Nina. I think every country in the world that I've worked with, I'm lucky that by the time a project comes to me, they already know that they want me involved. So I'm rarely trying to convince my client or the decision maker that what we can bring to the design process is useful. But the biggest resistance I see in clients are always around change and around cost. So my only advice to what I think your comment may be questioning is that I'm happy to share resources that can show that the kind of work we propose can begin with the smallest intervention that can have a tremendous amount of impact. For example, that purple pod transition space is a single couch, cost us under $4,000, which is about 3,000 euros to install. It comes in, it's completely disruptive. It can arrive in the evening and be there in the morning for the children to use. And it was just such a simple intervention that had such huge impact on the usability of the school. Like I showed you, the children were transitioning better, they were focusing better, but there was also the values of that social integration and positive reinforcement that we found. So I think explaining to teachers and decision makers that you can make minimal changes, but also if you make more major changes, the benefits are that you will be able to operate and do your work better. So one of the first set of feedback I received when we did those interventions in the very first school that I showed was the teachers themselves. It was one speech therapist that we did some acoustical modification for her speech therapy room. And within the first week, she called me and she said, I want to thank you because we were so focused on the benefits to the children for this experiment that I forgot and I didn't realize that as a teacher, I would also benefit because I'm working in a quieter space where the background noise has been mitigated for me too. We've been so consumed with thinking of it from the autistic lens, we've forgotten to think of it out of our own lenses as teachers, that we can do our jobs better when the space is organized. We can do our jobs better when the acoustics are modified. So I think that's important to communicate. The other thing around cost is they will say, well, it's too expensive to do what Magda's asking us to do, and we can't afford it. But what I would respond to that is some of the early research that we did showed that you can, with some of these strategies, increase the attention span of these children up to 3 times. So that means that if it's going to take me a month of instruction, with the distractions that a child has while they're in the classroom. Thomas was talking about the challenges that children have when they're disrupted and distracted and moving from one place to another. If I can increase the attention span of that child, that means that what takes me 1 month to teach them will take me a week and a half to teach them. And that is money, because that means that that teacher can move through a curriculum faster and can deliver the skill that the student needs in a shorter amount of time. So that time is released. That's a more efficient use of her salary and her time. She can give that time to another student, that she can put that time to another class. That student can move through the curriculum quicker and leave their space for another student to come in. So it becomes a more efficient operational model of the human resources that they have and the time resources that they have by just reorganizing a classroom and working on some sound mitigation. Then the students can, not all, learn 3 times faster. And that is saving money.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. The time is flying away and we have 3 minutes left. We have one more question, and I hope it will be a quick one and that Magda can give a quick answer so we can finish in some 5 minutes or something. So this will be the last question. Ann-Sofie Gråmunke, would you like to say your question?
Yes, hello, and thank you for a very nice presentation, very interesting. I was just wondering, Thomas was also writing in the chat about, I was thinking about the syllabus, how the syllabus will impact how you use the architecture or the rooms. And I wonder what thought you have about this, because in Sweden, for example, the LPO 11 was very different, and it changed the teacher in the front of the class to more group works, and that makes a lot of more noise, for example, acoustic problems and also visual problems. So I just wondered how you think about this relationship.
Well, quickly, I'll give you some quick examples. The first thing is that when I'm designing a school, the first thing I ask is, what is the pedagogical philosophy of the school, and what is the syllabus or the curriculum that you follow, so that we know, is it an applied behavioral analysis and task analysis? And in that case, it's very much about breaking the things down into small activities, or is it more about an emotional regulation curriculum that is based on providing emotional support for the child and it's more one-on-one and individualized. So I see the classroom as a physical representation of how the curriculum is delivered, and I do what I call a behavioral choreography. So I'll sit with the teachers and ask them, so how do you run the classroom? Is it like the example you gave? Is it a big group or is it small groups? And if it's small groups, how we can manage them so that there aren't distractions and that there aren't children that are unsupervised at different times. So the starting point is always the curriculum first.
Okay, thank you so much. It has really been a pleasure to hear you answer questions and comments and so on.